You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brewlosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, imperial yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com. Human beings seem to really like classification, and for good reason, as it serves the purpose of breaking large ideas and topics down into smaller, more manageable parts. Of course, doing this requires some level of sacrifice as well, as the focus on specifics intensifies. Whatever's in the periphery is more likely to be missed. When it comes to beer, there exists a handful of classification systems. We call them style guidelines, the most popular of which is put out by the Beer Judge Certification Program, or the BJCP. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and on this Brews Views episode, I'm joined by contributor Cade Jobe to share our unfiltered opinions on brewing to style.
Yeah, brewing to style, or using the style guidelines, what you take away. And this is unfiltered opinions, right? So this is not an experience episode. We're not going to talk about, the things that we do, or, our experiences. This is unfiltered. And so we'll share our opinions on the styles and why we think they are, what we would like to see, how, if things were different, what would they be like? And it should be a fun show.
Yeah, as you can attest, Cade, this is a topic I sort of struggled with when you first proposed it for an episode. Then I realized my issue was due largely to the opinions that I actually hold about brewing to style. We came up with a number of things to talk about related to this topic. We might go off into the weeds a little bit, but there's nothing wrong with that. I absolutely think this is going to be a fun one. Now, just a reminder that this is a Brews Views episode, which is specifically intended for us to share our unabashed views on certain topics. As such, we will not be censoring ourselves as much as we usually do. So if certain language is something that bothers you, you may want to pass on this episode. We're not going to be flagrant or intentionally offensive, just a little less filtered than usual. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. This month's guest is the short-circuited brewer himself, Brian Huntley, who has both a website and YouTube channel where he focuses on electric brewing, among other interesting things. I've been able to hang out with Brian a couple of times. He's a really great guy who knows his way around an electric brewery, probably better than most. And I'm confident this is going to be a fantastic session. If you want to be a part of it, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy no later than Friday, September 23rd, 2022, as Brian will be taking questions that Saturday, the 24th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd really appreciate it. Huge cheers to everybody who has taken the 2 minutes to do that already. We really do appreciate it. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who, in addition to having a badass YouTube channel chock full of great brewing related content, sell what we believe to be some of the best electric brewing systems on the market. If you've been considering making the move from propane to electric, you owe it to yourself to check out Clawhammer Supply. Whether you're after a 120 volt 5-gallon unit or something bigger like their powerful 240 volt 10-gallon system, Clawhammer has got you covered. Learn more about everything they have to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to check out their YouTube channel as well. Listener Nikolai McCarran from Melbourne, Australia, had some feedback on episode 246, where we talked about diluting wort to increase yield. Nikolai said, "In the last few months, I've been brewing a lot for friends' parties, events, and family. Typically, I do a single 5-gallon or 20-liter batch, but I wanted to make a bulk recipe that I could ferment at a moment's notice. So I brewed 51 liters, with 13 gallons, of 1077 OG hazy pale wort that I transferred hot into 3 17-liter or 4.5-gallon cubes. cubes. When I've got a friend's party coming up, I pop open a cube and top up with 3 to 5 liters of water, and then I ferment that. I guess you could call it a no-boil triple batch hot cube dilution. I've dubbed the recipe Punter's Paradise Hazy Pale, and it comes out to around 5 to 6% ABV. I just brewed my second batch of it yesterday, and it has gone down very well with my friends. I love the show, and shout out to the Merry Mashers Homebrew Club in Melbourne, Australia.
That's a really fun idea. I love this whole brewing cube, storage system that so you guys are doing down under. I mean, I wish, it does make a lot of sense, right? Like I think about like how many times do you just need like base wort for something, right? I just need like hazy pale wort, and then I might like add some dry hops to it or change up the yeast or something, right?
Yeah.
If you just had something that you could call like your base wort, it'd be really fun to just like put some, brew a huge batch, put it in some cubes, store it. And then, like he said, just ferment it, dump it in the fermenter, add some water to it to dilute it a little bit down to whatever starting gravity you want, and then play around with yeast and hops. I mean, that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
To do. I really love that idea. I wish I had some cubes. I might actually start doing that. It might make, because I think about like, number of experiments we could do, right? If you could just brew like a super high OG batch and then store it in some cubes and then, go from there. But
yeah, no, I'm with you. I love this idea. Such an easy way to ensure that you have beer ready when it's needed without much work, right? I've still yet to intentionally brew a high OG batch that gets diluted to increase my yield. But like I said in that episode, I think it's a rad idea for those who, again, want to just reduce the amount of work it takes to produce more beer. Awesome stuff. Thanks for the feedback, Nikolai. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a line on social media. All right, we got to take a quick break. When we're back, we'll be sharing our opinions on brewing to style. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. When I first got into craft beer and soon thereafter brewing, I was aware that there were certain styles, but it wasn't until I really got obsessed that I discovered the BJCP guidelines and learned that not only were there way more styles than I was aware of, but that each came with a set of fairly specific parameters. Cade, I was thinking we may as well kick things off by talking a bit about our views on style guidelines in general.
Yeah, of course. I think that's a good place to start. And I mean, the easiest one, like you mentioned at the top of the show, is to talk about the BJCP style guidelines, right? The Beer Judge Certification Program. And I want to stop there and pause for just a second, right? BJCP is Beer Judge Certification Program. All right. And so this is a fun thing that if you if you're a nerd like I am, and you actually spend time reading through the style guidelines, which I've done. I did it mostly when I was studying for BJCP or Cicerone exam. There's a big disclaimer, not disclaimer, but in the middle, and it says like the mission of the BJCP is to conduct exams, and so that's the whole point. Beer Judge Certification Program. These styles exist so that you can conduct examinations for training judges. I think that's a big one to just like start off with and talk about like our opinions on, right? Because I mean, I think people, especially certain brewers treat these things as like gospel, as like the beer style, BJCP style specifications, not guidelines. But again, these are out there so that we can exam or so we can make sure that judges know exactly what they're doing, right? Is that like a little bit, that's a kind of a little surprising for me, but it's like a really important opinion that I think we need to share.
Well, so my thought on that is this. You mentioned something that the BJCP points out, that their what they've created, their guidelines have been misused by brewers. Does that not sound a little bit familiar with what we do, right? That we put out this data, and then we get absolute people beat the shit out of us because they think we're trying to influence the way other people brew, when all we're doing is sharing stuff we find interesting, right? But in addition to loving classification and organization and being able to wrap our heads around specifics, we really like to presume that we understand other people's intentions, and that the intentions of the BJCP is to provide a set of guidelines so that people who are judging beer in America, at the very least, I know this is used internationally, but this did get its start in the United States, that people who are judging beer have a set of standards that they can go by to judge. It's the same way in my day job as a psychologist. It's the same argument that's made for diagnoses. Yes, not every version of psychosis or of depression looks exactly the same, but we have this idea now. We have this set of standards, or what we call symptoms in that field, that we can kind of say, you know what, it looks like this. It looks like it could be this. Let's treat it now from this other perspective, or from this specific perspective, and see what happens. It's the same thing with the Beer Judge Certification Program, the BJCP style guidelines, in my opinion. You're looking and saying, these set of guidelines, and we're going to break it down into more depth and give our opinions on all of that stuff in the next segment. But you're looking and saying, if you make a beer with these parameters, it's likely going to be a decent example of this style. And for that, I think that makes sense. That doesn't necessarily mean that I feel compelled to brew specifically to style all the time. I cannot tell you every time we brew a beer for an experiment or for a brew it yourself or whatever, and we attach a base style to it. Oh, this is a pale ale, and it falls just outside of the parameters defined by the BJCP. The number of emails that we get, oh, that's not an IPA, or that's not a pale ale because of, oh, your OG was, 2 specific gravity points too high. Are we really going to pick those nits? I mean, that's the part of it where I'm like, man, I don't even think Gordon Strong or Chris in England care that much, to argue about that. But there are people out there who view the BJCP style guidelines as almost biblical.
Right, exactly. It's this whole idea of like, it's that quote from Pirates of the Caribbean, right? It's like we consider the Pirates Code more guidelines than actual rules.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? But they are called guidelines. And so that was so there's a quote in the BJCP thing. It's like they're aware of this and they like try to like shame people. And so it's like they say, while we understand that our guidelines may have been misused in contexts beyond our original intent, we've also observed them being misused in competitions and for other BJCP purposes, such as exam preparation and grading. Some people misinterpret the guidelines and then often unknowingly instruct others in their misuse. Our hope is that the information in this section will help prevent many cases of misinterpretation and misuse in the future. If you encounter someone using the guidelines incorrectly, please refer them to this section.
Turn them in to the style police.
right. But I mean, that's just such a great thing, right? And I mean, so the question that Marshall and I are kind of riffing on right now now. It's like, is there an appropriate use of the style guidelines? There's another great part in there too, where it says in that forward, it says specifically, "We are not the beer police." And I'm just like, yes, because that resonates so well with me. I mean, not like you, Marshall. I have so many stories of people going like, "Oh, this is out of style because the ABV is too high," or whatever, or this is, I mean, if you're in a judging context and you're in a competition, you have to make these sorts of determinations, right? And I think that's the appropriate place for these style guidelines. And the BJCP sounds like they're kind of screaming at us a little bit, going like, "Hey, dummies, this is all just for competition." But people attach so much significance to these, and I'm guilty of that to some extent too, right? It's like, okay, if I'm going to brew a pale ale, I'm going to look at the BJCP style guidelines and make sure that my recipe is generally within the style, or using the software that I use, like Brewfather, or when I was using Beersmith, it tells you what the style guideline is, right? It's like on there, it's printed in the software. And so you can kind of see if you're within those ranges. But ultimately, at the end of the day, is there an appropriate use? Or are they just guidelines? Can you just do whatever you want? Ignore them at your leisure?
Well, obviously you can. There are so it's weird because I tend to be the type of person, and again, I think this is largely personality based, who doesn't really like rules for rules' sake. To me, if there's going to be guidelines or rules for anything, there should be a reason for it. The BJCP very clearly states that their reason is for beer judges, is so that when you're judging a beer, you have this set of standards that you can base your judging off of. Obviously, a double IPA is different than a British mild ale. To be able to have a set of guidelines that you can wrap around each of those styles, I think makes judging it very easy. The problem then becomes, well, okay, they are also providing these statistical parameters. So your OG has to be between such and such, your FG between such and such, and thus your ABV between such and such. Well, I can almost guarantee you that very, very few beer judges out there, and I am one. I'm a certified beer judge by the BJCP. They actually gave it to me, people. But that very few people can actually taste a 2-point gravity difference, in a beer. It's just we're not that refined. Our palates are not that well refined, and so the what I like using the BJCP for, and what I think probably where some of the opinions will come into play, is I do rely on the BJCP when I'm designing beers, even if I'm not going to compete with those beers, because the way I look at it is, Gordon and Kristen have done all of this work. Those are the two main people behind the BJCP and the changes that occur, over the years. And they do update the BJCP often. In fact, 2021 is the latest update from 2015. And I love the updates they make because they are inclusive. They're trying to include new styles of beer that are hitting the scene. Well, I like to brew to style, and I feel like for specific styles. Okay, I don't want to. That is not the end of my opinions. Trust me. But there are certain traditional styles where, in my head, I'm going, all right, these two folks, Kristen and Gordon Strong, have done so much work and so much research on these traditional historical styles of beer that I am going to rely on them and take them at their word that if I brew a beer that's within these parameters, I'm likely getting close to what the historical styles may have tasted like. Obviously, I'm not open fermenting, or fermenting in a Yorkshire Square or something. I'm not doing that, but I want to get as close to possible. And they, because of the hard work they've put into making the BJCP, and I do not mean to kiss their asses, but because of the hard work they've put into building those guidelines, I take them at their word, and they have yet to lead me astray so far. So on that front, if I'm trying to make a historical style, another one, perfect example for me is California Common. If you go and try to design a California Common without referring to some set of guidelines, whatever that may be, it can actually be pretty difficult to get it that exact color with the exact, bitterness that you're looking for and all of that. But you go to the BJCP, you read about traditional ingredients that they use, I mean, they provide so much context for each style. I find that piece of it very helpful personally.
Well, yeah, you hit the nail on the head there, right? California Common. If I go try to brew a California Common, what is a California Common? Right?
Exactly.
Like, I don't know what, I mean, I grew up in Texas. I mean, you grew up in California, you grew up in California and in Washington. So maybe you have a better idea of what a California Common would be than me. But if we had New England IPA, and you had never been to New England and tried an IPA in New England, how would you even know that the New England IPA existed if you didn't have style guidelines, right? And so I'm not kissing the BJCP's butt either, but to me, style guidelines serve a purpose. And I know that some brewers love to just like rage and be like, I'm not brewing a beer to style. I don't like boundaries. And, I don't wanna...
edgy, man. Yeah. So edgy. Whoa, man.
Yeah.
Not brewing to style.
Well, I mean, and to be fair, like I have some buddies who brew and they don't ever brew normal beers, right? They just don't. They don't like to brew Kolsch's and Pilsners. If they're going to brew a blonde ale, they're going to put like hibiscus in it or, blueberries or something, or they're going to add mint or pine tips or whatever the spruce tip thing is that people are doing in the Midwest that I don't understand. But,
me either, dude. But hey,
hey, Steve loves it. So talk to Steve about those.
And
so
we love Steve. So yeah,
and I love Steve. Yeah. So, but that's a great example, right? Like, what is a California Common? And somebody's got to sit down and do this work, right? Because or here's a great example too. The one that I love is American Pale Ale, right? I think everybody who is listening to this show has had an American Pale Ale. But what does that mean? How is an American Pale Ale different than an English ale? Or how is it different than an IPA? Where's the cutoff between IPA and English ale, right? Or American Pale Ale? What characteristic ingredients are in there? If you're just like starting from scratch and you don't know what to brew, these style guidelines have a huge amount of information in there. I mean, look at like historical practices, the commercial examples, the specifications, which you mentioned, which I have my own problems with the specifications. But then there's a description, right, about every style in there. And I just think I think that's super awesome. But I think the difficulty and the thing that I rage against, and I mentioned it, is just like, I think sometimes people are too rigid. I mean, like, you have to like strike this balance of like what's appropriate to write down. I mean, have you ever, I don't know if you have, Marsh, have you ever tried to write down a beer style on your own? Like, have you ever just been like, Cal Common is this, and write it down?
No, I mean, the closest I've gotten to that is hamming it up with friends who brew and, just sitting around talking about what is it that we get from, say an American Amber Ale or a California Common or whatever that, maybe it doesn't jibe exactly with what is included in the BJCP. But you used a word that really, that I think is important, that it's there's this rigidity in some ways of approaching the BJCP. And I want to point out, one, BJCP is not the only style guidelines that exist out there. It's the one that we are the most familiar with. But I feel like what we're talking about does on some level apply to most versions of style guidelines. We're talking more generally about the concept of having guidelines per style. I don't believe that it is the fault of the BJCP, AKA Gordon and Kristen, who really put so much effort, blood, sweat, and tears into ensuring that we have these guidelines available to us. I think it's the way that they get interpreted by the masses, right? And if you think about this, and this is one of the parts where I have to catch myself sometimes, I am not a flagrant brewer. I'm not going to go out there and just take handfuls of different grains and make beer. At the same time, I am not going to sweat it if I don't hit, if I'm brewing an American Pale Ale, but it happens to be a little bit higher OG, I don't feel like I need to call that an IPA just because it's higher OG. I feel like there's more to the gestalt of specific styles than just the one parameter. And so I'm okay fudging a little bit on those parameters just because the BJCP defined them as such doesn't make them the law, right? But we would not have new styles if it weren't for people breaking those rules. So to speak, that if it weren't for people saying, wait a minute, I like American IPA. It's great. That is the only IPA that's in the 2008 BJCP guidelines. I want to make this hazy version that tastes like fruit juice instead. Those people who define one of the world's most popular craft beers right now, which is hazy IPA, they broke the rules. They didn't abide by the style guidelines, and now that is included in the BJCP style guidelines. What does that say about the BJCP in general? They're open to including new things. I think that if you were to sit down with Gordon, he'd be like, man, we want more people stepping outside the bounds, creating new styles, creating new flavors and aroma profiles. That is the idea. This is a judging, a book that is built for judges to know what they're doing, to know what they're comparing this beer that they're drinking to a specific set of guidelines. And that part of it makes sense for me. Rigidly sticking to that and refusing to go outside of it, to me, does feel like it would be kind of boring at times. But we asked the question, are the style guidelines important? I would say they are. Are they essential? Not necessarily, but I do like, particularly for me, when I'm brewing more historical styles, I do tend to stick to them more specifically than I do if I'm brewing more modern, I guess you would say, like American styles of beer.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I guess there's also this whole like meta question too, right? It's like what goes into a style itself, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Like what even information do you put there? How do you describe the differences between American Pale Ale and IPA in any meaningful way? And I think that's a really cool like aspect of this too. Is it's like you've got this whole just kind of like I said, meta. Like okay, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to put this in there. But one of the other things I think that's important about the styles is the consumer communication, or the communication to the people that are drinking the beer, right? If I go to somebody, like you said, we'll use, Cal Common as an example. If I go to somebody and say, hey, here's a Cal Common, and I hand it to them, and they go, that tastes nothing like any Cal Common I've ever had before, right? Then I go, oh, well, that's just what I was calling it. If there's no style guideline out there, if there's no bumper rails, you could hand somebody a porter and go, hey, this is an American IPA. And they'd go, well, that's not what I thought I was ordering whenever I ordered a porter.
Yeah.
This is super bitter. I wanted a chocolate, creamy, nice porter. I don't want a hazy, juicy fruit bomb. That's not what I was trying to get. So I think there's also this aspect of it that gets lost too, right? Is
yes.
We need to be able to communicate about beer as well. And that's another reason why I think beer style guidelines are important. Because if you don't have somebody out there defining what a style is, or at least making an attempt to put some information out there about what the style is, how can you go into a bar and order a hazy IPA? How do we find out about things like that? I mean, it's just like, no, hey, it's this beer, this brewery Treehouse, or this brewery Trillium over on the East Coast is just doing something interesting, and they have this one really good beer that's got lots of hops in it. Right?
Complete and utter anarchy.
Oh,
you remove the style guidelines altogether, you got complete anarchy. In fact, that'd be a fun brewing project for somebody to take on, call it Anarchy Brewing Company or something, and you just don't use any style guidelines. You just come in all willy-nilly and make beers. Another area where I feel like and this is going to sound obvious when I say it, but where I feel like style guidelines are absolutely essential are when you're entering competitions. I mean, that's why you're doing it. Mm-hmm. The funny thing about that, again, and I kind of have a tit for tat for everything I'm going to say here. There was one time, this is a little anecdote, personal story that I've got, where I brewed a Vienna lager, right? That was my entire intention. It was before I narrowed my recipe down to being far more simple than it used to be. So I brew this beer. My intention, right? That's the key word here, is my intention was a Vienna lager. I designed it in my recipe calculator to be a Vienna lager. It hit all the marks. I get done with it. It hit all the numbers were spot on for Vienna lager. I pull it out. I share it with my friends. I don't tell them what my intention was. And I think all but one of them thought it was a Märzen, thought it would fit that style more than it did a Vienna lager. Makes sense, right, Cade? Fairly similar.
Close enough.
Close enough, but still very rich. A little bit more rich than a Vienna lager, at least. One person thought it was just dark enough to bump into the Munich Dunkel range, right? It's still on the paler end of a Munich Dunkel, right? So here's the deal. So I'm sitting there. My intention was Vienna lager. My friends thought it tasted like a Märzen. So what is it? Is it a Vienna lager, or is it a goddamn Märzen? Who knows? So my thing, the point I want to make though is, whereas in relationships, I strongly believe that intention does matter. Hey, love, I did not mean for this to come across this way. I meant for it this way. My intention was this. In brewing, that doesn't matter. In my opinion, in brewing, that doesn't matter, I should say. I was talking to some home brewers a few years ago about competitions in general and competing, and how I felt when in the competitions that I participated in where I felt like I was successful, how I approached doing that. And the way I approached it was I would brew a beer. I might have had an intention for it to be a Vienna lager, but if my friends who I trust said it tasted more like a Märzen, I would submit it as a Märzen instead because I didn't care what my intention was. That didn't matter. What mattered was how it's perceived by the drinker. And for competing specifically, I think that's important. So you go and you look at Vienna Lager and Märzen, and maybe I don't hit all the marks for Märzen on a numbers level, but on a flavor, on a perceptive level, it does. That matters more to me than the BJCP style guidelines. And I don't know, what the BJCP would think about that, but they don't know. You're not reporting to them what your OG and FG and ABV are. You're just giving them a beer. And you
exactly.
This is not, you have no moral obligation to the BJCP. And I will say that openly, outwardly. If you brew a beer that hits none of the marks, but it tastes exactly like the style that another style maybe you weren't aiming for, submit it as that style and you're fine. You're not going to go to hell for that. I promise you. They're not even going to know. And you may even do well in competition with that. Don't feel bad about that. It was, like I said, I was talking to these homebrewers a couple of years ago, and that was their big thing. Well, I'm not going to submit it as a Märzen when I tried to make a Vienna lager. It's like, well, that's fine with me. It tastes like a Märzen. So, maybe you're just not going to score well as a Vienna lager either. But
well, right. I mean, and we talk about this all the time whenever we're judging at competitions. It's like whenever I'm judging an IPA, if all of the IPAs are like a certain level of bitterness and one of them sticks out as just like more bitter, that one might actually get scored higher, even
exactly,
though it may have IBUs off the chart just because it stuck out, right? Like in judging. But the other thing too, one of your comments about like the amber lager versus Märzen difference, I do this all the time. Anytime I enter a competition, I always brew my beer, whatever style I was trying to hit for the competition, and then I taste it, and I might enter it in more than one style. Like there's no rule that says you can't do that, right? Like I don't, like you said, I don't owe anything to the BJCP for the competition. I can enter the same damn beer in different styles, and I've heard this feedback so many times from people. Like this is sort of a bastardization of the feedback, but it's like, hey, I entered this beer as a Pilsner, and it said it wasn't hoppy enough, and then I entered it as a Helles, and it said it was too hoppy.
Exactly.
And so it's like, oh well, crap. I mean, which one is it? I mean, those both taste very similar. And then you get to people that are going to like argue, and they're going to be like, well, a Pilsner is going to have 45 IBUs and it's going to be very hoppy and have a nice rounded bitterness, but the Helles is going to have no bitterness at all. So any bitterness in a Helles is totally out of style, right? And it's like, well, like, hold on, there's some like squish in here too, right? I mean, and I think that's one of those things that we'll get to the specifications in the next segment, but that squish is important. Yes. I mean, like I grab onto that and I hold onto that anytime I'm a judge. I'm always like, hey, just because that's what the style says, the style guideline says this beer is really good. All right. And if it's like marginally inside the style, I'm not going to make a comment that says out of style, better as this example, unless it's like really obvious, right? Like if you've got something that's just not bitter at all and you're putting it in an American pale ale, I'm going to say, hey, the bitterness is out of style. It's just not bitter enough.
Yeah.
And I think that's totally funny, but there are some like there's some squishiness to it, but one of the things that is hard, right? I don't have a good answer for this, but it's one of those things. It's the categories, the way that they group the styles in the BJCP, and especially when you're judging, some of that can be really difficult because it's like, okay, amber lager, American amber lager is not in the same category as Märzen, right?
Yeah,
they're two different categories. And when I'm talking about categories, I'm talking about like the major groupings of the styles, and even the BJCP says that this is a direct quote: categories are artificial constructs that represent a collection of individual subcategories that may or may not have any historical, geographic, or traditional relationship to each other. Do not infer that membership in a style somehow relates individual beer styles to each other. The only reason why styles are grouped together is to assist with the managing of competition's scale and complexity. And I just think about that and I'm like, oh man. So like, wait, so if two things are even in the same category, you can't even relate them to each other. And I think that's another thing that people really struggle with whenever they're interpreting style guidelines. It's like, hey, those titles mean absolutely nothing. You can't look at those. Like the German beers or the German light lagers, I can't remember exactly what that category heading is. I think it's actually just, I think it's European lager, right? Like, dark European lager is Munich Dunkel and Schwarzbier. Amber malty European lager, Märzen Rauchbier and Dunkelsbach, but different than international or Czech, right? I mean, some of those things are just like, okay, wow, those are location driven, so maybe not the best example, but you can't just relate beers as the same, right? And I think that's something that just makes interpreting the guidelines difficult, but also like judging itself difficult as well.
Yeah. One of the things that I've done, I don't want to go too far down the path of competing. We've done episodes on that, but I do think it relates to the BJCP talk of the style guidelines in general. One of the fun things that I've done is I'll brew. I love amber lagers, and so that I'm referring to Vienna lager a lot because that's one of my top 3 favorite styles. And so I'll brew. There was this one time I brewed a Vienna lager. I had 10 gallons of the stuff. I think I used it for an experiment as well, and then I submitted it into the NHC. In fact, the National Homebrew Competition as a Vienna lager, a Czech amber lager, 2 other ones, a Märzen, and then something else. I forget exactly what it was. Well, 3 of those ended up being on the same table, so the same judging pair judged the same beer as different styles. And what cracked me up, and I'm not trying to diss the judges. This is part of the reason that I don't judge much anymore. They tasted it as a Märzen, said it wasn't malty enough. All right, very cool. That's great. But it also has diacetyl in it. Okay, so you're detecting diacetyl in that one. They gave it like a 32 or a 34, something like that altogether. Not too shabby. They move along. They get to my Vienna lager. Same exact beer, but it's called a Vienna lager. I get a 42 or a 43 on it. Perfectly clean beer. Great example of the style. One of the best in the flight. They move on. They taste it as a Czech amber lager or whatever else it was. And, not hoppy enough. And it has acetaldehyde. And I'm like... Those were the same exact beer. And so the funny thing to me, though, is you're paying for these competitions. So if anything, they owe you. You owe them nothing. That's why I like to tell people I have no moral obligation to the BJCP. You can submit any beers you want under any category you want. You're paying to do that. So by all means, use it up. Do not feel like you are breaking the rules if you do that. At least that's my opinion. And again, this is not a legal body. They're providing guidelines for people to judge by. If you taste a beer and you think it's something else that you intended, other than what you intended, then by all means, feel free to call it that and compete under that as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, those are some of our general opinions on brewing to the parameters laid out in the BJCP guidelines. When we're back from this break, we're going to shift our focus to some of the more specific aspects of style classification. We'll be right back. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. With over 100 beer styles recognized by the BJCP, we simply don't have enough time to opine about every single one of them on this episode. So instead, we're going to focus on our views of some of the metrics the BJCP relies on and what we think in regards to brewing certain styles. I was thinking, Cade, I don't know if we discussed this earlier, but we could also kind of break down, in addition to OG, FG, all that stuff, break down some of the more basic stuff like appearance, aroma, mouthfeel, flavor, stuff like that as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think we should definitely hit all those, but I do think it's a good place to start with my biggest pet peeve, which is the numbers. And it's the ABV, the OG, FG, SRM, and IBU. And okay, so like I say this is my pet peeve, and it's a pet peeve of mine because they matter and they don't matter. And like I still feel so hypocritical saying that, but I'll give you this story, right? So I when I was studying for the Cicerone exam, a huge portion of the Cicerone exam is understanding beer styles, and it's not just understanding like describe a Märzen or describe an amber lager. Some of the questions on the Cicerone exam will say like, all right, here's a beer is IBU of 47 and an ABV of 5.2 and has an SRM of 9.1 or something. What style is it? And you got to be like, oh shit, like what is that?
That sounds tough.
like oh fuck, or it'll ask a question like American Pale Ale IBU range is. I'm making this up because it's been a while since I've studied, but American Pale Ale IBU range is 35 to 55 IBU, or what is the IBU range of American Pale Ale? And then answers would be like 35 to 55, 32 to 41, 32 to 57, or some crazy thing like that. It's like, oh shit, I didn't memorize like the exact difference in IBUs of those things. So because that doesn't matter, like you said earlier, like I can't taste the difference between 57 and 55 IBUs. So if I brew an IPA that I get tested at 57 IPU, or an American Pale Ale that I get tested at 57 IPUs, is that outside of the style guidelines? And I mean, like, who cares? Like, nobody cares about that. So that's like a huge pet peeve of mine, especially because like the Cicerone exam's about training Cicerones, which beer sommeliers, so people that can talk and like talk about what beer pairs well with food and how to make beer and troubleshoot draft systems and all these other things. But we care if they know the number of IBUs in the range in the style guidelines of an American Pale Ale. Yeah. So that's just a frustrating thing for me. And I don't know. I just think that testing on those numbers is super silly because they're at some point totally arbitrary. Well, if I taste a beer and it tastes like an American Pale Ale, but its ABV is 4.9 or 4.7, I don't like. Who gives a shit?
you are making me think of the old. Remember when Session IPA came out, and I remember listening to podcasts and talking to other brewers, and they're like, "So a pale ale, so it's a pale ale." Right. Like, okay, so you basically IPA, yeah. you've basically removed some crystal malt from a classic American 1980s version pale ale, and you're calling it something different. Like, just call it a pale ale. It's just a different version of a pale ale. It's funny to me. So we're going to get back to talking about easily measurable parameters like OG, FG, and ABV. Those are things that we actually can we can measure very easily. IBU, yeah. I mean, Cade, I feel like we could do an entire episode just commiserating over the International Bitterness Unit. The thing about it is this. It was created by, my understanding, it was the Tinseth, at least, I think his name is Glenn Tinseth, created that as a home brewer. And it was this whole idea that, the amount of hops you use based along with knowing what alpha acid those hops are, that you could figure out, you could apply a number to the beer used making those specific hops. One of my understandings is that he did it using Cascade, and that he admits that it may be different for other types of hops. And yet we still rely on that largely for when it comes to meeting BJCP parameters. So, you go and you look, what I want to brew a beer, a pale ale that has, 52 IBU. I go to Brewfather and I put in the hops that I've got, and I'm doing everything to a T because that's how I brew, and I'm a nut about it. And it says that I'm exactly at 52 IBU. I can almost guarantee if you send that into a lab, it is not going to test at 52 IBU. And yet that's the parameter that we're basing it on, is what this calculator spits out at the end. And we love Brewfather. I mean, I'm a huge fan, but
for sure. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's you. If when we've done testing, when we've done actual lab testing on bitterness units, it's funny to me that they use IBU. I wish the lab tests would let the homebrewers just have IBU, because it's just been so watered down. The meaning of what an international bittering unit or bitterness unit is, they come up with something else, just bitterness level or BL or something like that. Because what you measure in a lab consistently is different than what we're predicting based on, again, the hops we're using and the alpha acid levels and what it's just so confusing to me.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we could do a whole episode on IBUs, and I know this because I have 2 upcoming episodes of the Brew Lab that I'll sneak peek here for people. One of them is an episode with John Paul May, who's the technical director at Hopsteiner, and he did some work on dry hopping and how dry hopping impacts the IBU test. And come to find out, dry hopping increases the IBU test like ridiculously high, but it doesn't actually increase the actual calculated IBUs or the actual perception of bitterness.
Yeah.
And that's because of compounds that are in dry hops, which you should listen to that episode and we'll talk a lot about. But the IBU test, if you dry hop over, if you're calculating 35 parts per million or 35 IBUs on your calculator, if you're dry hopping at anywhere over that, the IBU test is telling you nothing. It tells you absolutely nothing. It's totally irrelevant.
Go figure.
And the reason for that is because the IBU test was made whenever we were brewing lager beers, right?
Yep.
We were brewing American lager beers at 25 to 40, IBU, and that was all that mattered, right? You needed to be able to define some bitterness level on lager beer, and it works great in that range. But if you dry hop, all out the window.
Yeah.
The other thing is there's an episode with a homebrewer named John Paul Hosom, and he just came up with this awesome new calculator, and it takes into account everything. It takes into account like the size of your vessel, the dry hopping rates, modern science on what we understand from bitterness, contributions of whirlpool, timing of whirlpool, heat of whirlpool, what the different variety of hops. He did 300 different experiments and had them all tested at IBU and made a calculator that spits out an incredibly accurate IBU number.
Wow.
So it's fantastic. So listen to those 2 upcoming episodes of the Brew Lab. I tease those. But again, yeah, like you mentioned, what the hell is the IBU telling me? And again, now if I know that the IBU at, higher IBU, once I'm dry hopping a pale ale or an IPA, the IBU totally doesn't matter at all. Like, what's the point of having that? And why is it in the style guideline? And why are you, torturing poor Cicerone studying or BJCP study, or, people that are studying for that by making them memorize this. But again, from the forward of the BJCP, it says the primary mission is to conduct exams. Okay. And so it makes sense. It's easy to examine people based on numbers, right? Because it's just memorization.
Exactly.
Right? Like that's really easy to do. And it does set some style ranges, right? So I think another great example too is like, okay, so, Hazy IPA says it's 6.0 to 9.0 ABV. American IPA says it's 5.5% to 7.5% ABV. Right? Why are those different? Like, I mean, I would love to ask somebody that question, but I'm being a little bit facetious. But what if I brewed a hazy IPA that was 5.7?
Yeah.
Right? Is that now like out of style? And is anybody going to be able to tell that? How do you decide that 6.0 to 9.0 is the range for hazy IPAs? Right?
So I have an idea. I think what happens is when Gordon and Kristen are sitting down, they're looking at classic examples, commercial examples, and saying it seems like all of the classic hazy IPA that's out there falls within these ranges. And so viewing hazy IPA as completely distinct from American IPA, that piece of it makes sense to me. But I don't think either of them would say, yeah, but if you fall outside of that, it's no longer called a hazy IPA.
Yeah,
I don't think they care about that. I think what they're doing is trying to provide, again, some structure for those who want to brew it to style, as it were, as well as for judges, as we've mentioned before. One of the things, I don't want to harp too much longer on IBU, but this is one of those topics that I feel like it's so easy to go down rabbit holes. You can go into Brewfather, and you can. I think it defaults to Tinseth. Design a recipe. Let's say it spits out a 55 IBU pale ale or whatever. You go and you change it to the Rager formula. That IBU number is going to change. Then you go and you change it to Garrett's, and it's going to change again. And then you go and you have it lab tested, and then it changes again. What is it that you're going for?
Well, yeah, and add John Paul Hosums into that too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and then so one of the best bits of advice that I ever got from somebody was before I had really gotten into brewing for competition. I'm looking, going, well, I brewed. I had a group of friends who we were all brewing the same styles, and then we'd compare them at our monthly meetings. And we were doing this, and my beers would come out. We would use the same exact amount of hops, same exact amount of water, but our process was different. Our gear was different. We're making essentially the same style, right? Except, my beers, for example, would taste less bitter than say Sean's beer. And I'm looking, going, what is that? Why is that? We did the same thing with our water profile. All of us did the same thing. Well, on my system, something was just different to where I need to add more hops to get the same bitterness level, or I should say the same perceived bitterness. Is it that our IBU are exactly the same if they were to be measured? I mean, we use the same amount of hops, same type of water profile, same grist, same everything, but yours is perceptibly more bitter than mine. Well, for me, I realized in order for me to get the bitterness that I want, say in an American IPA or an American Pale Ale, I actually have to shoot for a calculated IBU that is outside of the BJCP's recommended range. I have to, in order to get what to me, I perceive as being that classic bitterness characteristic. So that's another thing about the BJCP guidelines, or guidelines in general, style guidelines in general, where I get a little flaky. It's like, okay, I get it. If you could measure all of these in an ideal world in a lab, and your beer hits all of these marks, then yes, it qualifies for that style. But there are things that you're going to have to adapt based on your brewing system in order for it to be perceptibly a specific style. And I think that's just as important.
Well, yeah, exactly. But you hit on something right there that I did want to mention, right? You said you can test these things in a lab. And that's, I think, what is super important about those metrics, right? Because you can take an OG, FG, you can take ABV, you can take SRM and IBU. You can objectively measure those, right? And so I think so much of what we talk about in styles is squishy. Remember, I talked about the squishiness of the styles. Like when we're talking about some of the things we'll talk about in a minute, appearance, aroma, none of those things are necessarily objectively measurable because we're using humans as the instrument, right? We're using subjectivity to tell us what those things are, or like what's medium versus strong. We'll get there. But the saving grace of these numbers is, like you said, you can test these things. So if I brew a beer that is OG in this range, FG in this range, ABV in this range, IBU in this range, SRM in this range, it's probably going to taste like that style, right? Like
exactly.
And you can rely on that. And those are things you can measure as you're going along through the process. I mean, most homebrewers aren't measuring ABV or IBU, but you're using some sort of calculator to predict it. And like you said, Marshall, once you understand your system, because this is another big part of it, once you understand your system, you know how to use IBU information from the style guidelines to get where you want to go. Right?
Exactly.
And I think that's a really, really strong benefit of the styles. I mean, I shat on the numbers a whole lot, but they do serve a really, really good big purpose, right? And that's something even that I use in my own brewing. Now, one of the numbers that I think is most dependent on your particular system is OGFG, right? And that's in there. That's in the style guidelines. It's a number that's there. But the OG, like for example, we talk about this all the time on my experiments. I get terrible efficiency on my experiments. I'm like in 60 or 65. If I'm brewing at 60 or 65% on my efficiency, and Marshall, you're brewing at 85% on your system, our OGs are going to be totally different, right? Actually, no, let me take that back. We can make our OGs exactly the same. I just add more grain into my system and we hit the exact same OG or FG, right? But if I just took something and said like, okay, my system, I'm brewing at a different efficiency, so I'm just going to put like 10 pounds of grain or something in there.
Exactly.
I don't hit the OG or FG that I need to hit to get into the style guidelines. So there's also this there's this system aspect of it too. Or even if we start at the same OG, we might not end at the right FG because we whatever system process, there's some different water chemistry. That's another one too that I was wondering about earlier. Like, why aren't we talking about sulfite to chloride ratios in terms of metrics for measuring this? Because I can guarantee you an amber lager that's got a high sulfate ratio is going to taste outside of style.
Oh yeah,
for amber lager.
I mean, we've shown that consistently that water profile, mineral profile matters, right? That it has a perceptible impact. My thing when it comes to the strength parameters, OG, FG, and ultimately ABV, is that again, historical styles. When you look at historical British beers, right? You've got mild, you've got ESB, extra special bitter, a strong bitter, whatever you want to call these nowadays. You look at that; they are largely based on strength. The thing is, if you make a stronger beer, you have to use more. If everything else equal, system-wise, you have to use more grain. That additional grain is going to contribute additional flavor, and that will change the character of that beer. So again, if you're able to get away with making a mild ale that tastes like a strong bitter, then by all means, I don't care what you call it. But I do see for styles like that, there is some meaningfulness to the strength parameters, in my opinion, because I do feel like, I'm thinking specifically of historical British beers here, that the strength is what ultimately defined those styles, right? The mild was called mild because it was low ABV.
Oh man, I mean, that's where you get into that whole other separate discussion, right? I mean, we brought it up a little bit in the first half, but like, what defines a style? And like you said, for those British beers, the differences oftentimes was just the strength of the beer, right?
Exactly.
And that was it. And so if you don't have the strength parameter there, how can you describe it? It may not make a big difference in terms of American Pale Ale, right? But it does, or the difference between American Pale Ale and IPA may not have anything to do with the OG or FG, or it might, but some of those beers, like you said, the historical British styles are very dependent on their strength, and that's a defining characteristic of the styles. You've got to put all these in there too. And we talked about numbers, but we got to spend some time talking about the squishy stuff too, right? The perceived characteristics,
right?
And I one of the things I love about the style guidelines is this overall impression that they put on every style, right? I'm like, every time I read an overall impression, I'm like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Except when you start comparing them against each other, because then they overlap quite a bit. But I love that aspect of it, because then to me, that's like a takeaway, right? Okay, I know if I hit these specifications, I'll be somewhere around here, but the overall impression is like what you're shooting for. If you want to brew an American lager and hit it straight down the aisle, right? Light corny is okay, but it should be totally free of any defects, right? It should be a clean, crisp. It shouldn't have any diacetyl. It should have no acetaldehyde. It should be crisp, clean, light, and refreshing. And it says those things in overall impression, right?
Yeah.
So if you're trying to brew an American style lager, that's what it should be. It shouldn't have caramel malts in it. It shouldn't have, chocolate malts. It shouldn't be hoppy. It shouldn't be super bitter. It should just be crisp, light, refreshing, and beer-flavored beer.
Yeah. I do feel like the BJCP does a good job in those overall impressions without being too pointed. I don't think those overall impressions are intended necessarily to say, if it falls outside of this, then it's just not that. What they're doing is saying,
exactly.
Hey, the majority of samples of this style of beer that you're going to have should, have overall, right, should have a similar impression as what we're writing out here. It's okay for it to go outside of style a little bit though. And I feel like obviously if you're the person out there who loves brewing specifically to style, I love that as well. Go for it. I know that there are some traditional German brewers out there who only make Pilsner and Helles exactly how it was made, 200 years ago or whatever. And that's badass. I mean, more power to you. But also at the same time, if you're competing or you're brewing for friends, whatever end of the spectrum you're on, I think using the guidelines as kind of a rough outline for designing your beer and then brewing it, and then just not getting up in arms if you don't hit your OG specifically, or, if it ends up being a little bit darker than you expected, that's okay. It doesn't mean that it's not the style that you are intending to brew. Though, if it tastes like a different style, don't feel bad calling it that either. I mean, I'm going to get back to that too. So
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's always this, like when I was a lawyer, there was always this balance, this fine line of information that you're doing whenever you're drafting something. When you're writing a contract or a divorce decree or laws or something, you have to say enough that you're specific and that you're clear about your intentions, but not so much that everything gets manipulated, right? Beyond what you intended. So it's like if you put too much information in the overall impression, it can, or in any of these categories like appearance, aroma, flavor, all of those things, you can make them such that all of the lines are blurred and there's no more delineation, right? I'll give you a great example. Lager, ale, right?
Yeah.
I mean, those are two different things, right? They're brewed with different yeasts, but oh my gosh, like ales are a huge spectrum. If you just said ale and that was what was listed in the overall impression, we wouldn't have any information. We wouldn't be able to determine the difference between an American pale ale and a porter, or an imperial, imperial IPA or something like that.
Exactly.
So you have to have this, but there is an element of subjectivity that has to come into it too. You see words like medium or strong or, low or high. And those are all relative terms. I mean, when I was talking with Jeff Daly on the Brew Lab about talking about running a sensory panel, those are things that Jeff tries to define in his sensory panel by getting the panel to agree. So they'll have some standards, they'll taste through them, and they'll all talk about them, and they'll talk about it as a panel like, okay, when I try this beer, this is what medium bitterness is. It's this beer. And when we report our results, it means this is medium based off of this reference scale. But you can't do that when you're just sort of putting something out there for everyone to look at. So I think it strikes this really awesome balance, especially when you get into this squishy, aroma, overall appearance, overall impression, appearance, flavor, mouthfeel, all that other stuff. And I really appreciate that about the BJCP BJCP guidelines.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's a good way to kind of finish this up is that I think both of us agree that the BJCP guidelines serve a wonderful purpose. Personally, I think it sounds like we're on the same page that we're not necessarily married to the style guidelines, but they do serve as a great jumping off point for most styles, especially for me at least, those historical styles. And again, if you fall outside of the parameters, don't beat yourself up. That's perfectly fine, especially if the beer still tastes like what you were going for. Well, Cade, that is all the time that we've got on Brewing to Style. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we finish up?
No, I think we're all good. I think we covered it all. Hopefully we didn't piss anybody off. But again, I want to say the BJCP styles are a fantastic resource. They're well written. It's a wealth of information. Use them as you want, and brew to style with them or totally ignore them, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, exactly. And if you are going to go the anarchistic route, please send us some of your beers. I'd really like to try those. All right. Well, don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab, where Cade takes you into the lab with brewing scientists to discuss research they've performed, and make sure to keep up with all of our beer and brewing antics over at brewlosophy.com. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through